Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be back with you. We enjoyed our time with you last time, and it's been very encouraging this morning. I feel like I'm somewhat redundant. There's been such an encouraging time of testimony and prayer this morning. Thank you for that. Okay. A friend of mine used to be a bookbinder. He still occasionally uses his considerable skills for taking old damaged books and restoring them to their pristine condition. His bookshelves are home to fabulous leather-bound volumes that are hundreds of years old. And if you know which drawers to look in, you'll also find books with broken spines and split covers, and some with no covers at all. Some look beyond hope. In reality, they are candidates for restoration, awaiting my friend's caring attention. In the last chapter of John's Gospel, there's a remarkable encounter between Jesus and Peter. It comes after Peter and 6 other disciples had been out fishing all night on the Sea of Galilee. The next morning, Jesus greeted the disciples from the shore. He had lit a fire on the beach and invited the 7 fishermen to a breakfast of bread and fish. After breakfast, Jesus returned to Peter and addressed him as Simon. That was Peter's name before Jesus renamed him Peter. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? This time Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? And Peter said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. Peter was a man in need of restoration. That's why Jesus took Peter aside. On the night of Jesus' arrest, Peter had denied that he was a follower of Jesus. The disciple who had promised to lay down his life for Jesus had saved his own skin rather than acknowledge Jesus. His actions called into question his very identity as a disciple of Jesus. Jesus came to restore Peter. We see a hint of this in the way he addresses Peter. All 3 times that Jesus names Peter here, he calls him Simon, son of John. Now in John's Gospel, Jesus hasn't called Peter that name since the first chapter. That was when Jesus met and renamed him Peter. The fact that he addresses Peter as Simon, son of John, suggests that Jesus is taking Peter back to the beginning. Jesus also has restoration in mind when he asks, do you love me more than these? The words more than these refer to the fish that Peter and the other disciples have just caught. The context leading up to Jesus' question is concerned almost exclusively with the disciples' fishing trip. John even gives the precise number of their bumper catch, 153 large fish. I think some of us would be envious of that, wouldn't we? It was a fisherman's dream, and Peter was a fisherman, or at least he had been until Jesus had called him years earlier. And that, of course, is Jesus' point. Jesus takes Peter back to those early days and asks him again, Peter, are you ready to leave the fish behind and follow me? But there is more here. The last time Peter warmed himself at a fire, he was in the high priest's courtyard. On that occasion, he denied Jesus 3 times. Now, with the warm embers still glowing on the breakfast fire, Jesus asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? Peter has the chance to reaffirm his love for Jesus once for every time that he had denied it. Jesus doesn't toss damaged people aside. He sets about to restore Peter with all the care and skill of a master bookbinder. Life damages us all. As often as not, the damage is caused by a combination of what life throws at us and how we respond. That was certainly true of Peter. Peter thought Jesus was amazing. This reality had dawned on Peter as he watched Jesus forgive sinners, heal the sick, give sight to the blind, walk on water, calm a stormy sea, and raise the dead. During his years with Jesus, Peter had grown to anticipate a time when Jesus would bring in his kingdom, when he would overthrow the Jewish religious establishment and throw out the Roman political establishment. When the time came, Peter was ready to fight alongside his Lord. That time appeared to have arrived on the evening that Jesus was arrested. Earlier that evening, Peter had publicly stated that he would follow Jesus even if it meant laying down his life. And sure enough, when they came to arrest Jesus, Peter took up a sword and cut off the ear of a man named Malchus, a servant of the high priest. But things went pear-shaped for Peter. Jesus didn't fight. In fact, he told Peter to put away his sword, and then Jesus handed himself over to the soldiers. This was not what Peter had anticipated, and we can only guess at the confusion Peter must have experienced that evening. And it was in the midst of his confusion that the challenge came. Weren't you one of his followers? Life's challenges and our misguided attempts to respond to them, they make a potent mix for producing damaged Christians. It can lead to disappointment with our lives, even a sense of disappointment with Jesus. Things we expected him to do, he hasn't done. For Peter, Jesus didn't do anything like what he'd anticipated. For us, things we thought Jesus would protect us from, he hasn't. Broken marriages, failed ministries, children who have wandered from the faith, sickness, addiction, business failure, financial disasters, broken dreams, deeply, deeply hurtful church experiences. The list is long. Whatever the reason, and no matter how much of it is our own fault, the result is essentially the same. We're damaged, and our commitment to Jesus can be damaged too. The sense of purpose we used to have has been replaced by a sense of drift. We need to find our way back to the relationship with Jesus that we once knew, and the sense of living for him that we once enjoyed. Where does the journey back begin? It begins at the same place that it began for Peter. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Our Christian faith centers on a person, not on a principle, not a philosophy, and not on a code of conduct. Our faith centers on Jesus Christ, which means that every aspect of our lives is lived out of a love relationship with Jesus Christ, whether that's our work, our play, our laughing, our crying, our family life, our time spent with friends, our entertainment, our service for others. Every bit of it is an expression of our love for Jesus Christ. Our lives are love gifts to him. At least they should be. And that is why the way back from wherever it is we find ourselves is through reaffirming our love for Jesus. In her book Inkheart, Cornelia Funk uses a character named Dustfinger to play with the idea of what it would be like to know how your life is going to end. Understandably, Dustfinger is horrified at the thought of being told how his story ends. I can't imagine that any of us wants to know how we're going to die. What if it turns out to be next week or next year? And what if it is slow and painful? Who would want to risk knowing that? And why would anyone want to burden us with that knowledge? And yet Jesus does precisely that to Peter. I tell you the truth, Jesus said. When you were younger and dressed yourself and went where you wanted, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." There can be no doubt that Jesus here tells Peter how he's going to die. John says as much when he explains that Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And Peter himself clearly understood Jesus' meaning. In his reply to Jesus, he asks, "What about John?" Good old Peter, he asks a good question, doesn't he? He says, if I'm going to die, what about John? Peter is keen to discover if John will suffer the same fate. And it's clear from Jesus' response that John's calling isn't Peter's business. If I want him to remain alive until I come, what is that to you? John and Peter understood what Jesus was saying, but I suspect it's a little less obvious to us. The first thing to notice is Jesus' contrast between youth and old age. The contrast hinges on the fact that when he was young, Peter did as he wished, whereas when he is old, he'll be made to do what he does not want. This suggests that his death will not come to him naturally, but will be forced on him by others. In other words, Peter would die a martyr at the hands of his oppressors. The second point to notice are the words, when you are old, you will stretch out your hands. In the ancient world, these words were understood to be a reference to crucifixion. This stretching out of the hands took place when they tied a prisoner to the cross member and forced him to carry it to the place of crucifixion. Church tradition on this point is not particularly strong, but what exists confirms that Peter was martyred, and there is also a tradition that he was crucified. This must have been shocking news to Peter, and you have to wonder what value there was in telling Peter such awful news. But Jesus was not without his reasons. These words are part of a larger interview between Peter and Jesus, in which Jesus is restoring Peter after he had denied him on the night of his arrest. The news that Peter would be martyred was directly relevant to Peter's restoration, a restoration to the place of leadership in the early church. Recall, for example, that in the upper room on the night Jesus was arrested, Jesus told his disciples that he was about to go away, and he said, "You cannot follow me now." They didn't understand, of course, that when Jesus spoke of departing, he was referring to his crucifixion. Peter didn't like the idea of Jesus leaving and insisted on following Jesus. He even said, with rather more confidence than subsequent events would justify, that he would lay down his life for Jesus. Jesus, of course, knew that Peter was overreaching himself, and he told Peter at the time that before the rooster crowed, he would deny him 3 times. Now, in the wake of Peter's denial, his brave words sound rather hollow and would be an obstacle to his leadership among Jesus' followers. And so it is that as part of Peter's restoration, Jesus makes it known that Peter would one day lay down his life for him, just as Peter had said he would. Jesus, who had predicted that Peter would deny him, now makes it known that Peter will indeed die for him. In fact, Peter would follow Jesus in death by crucifixion. Jesus hinted at this when they were in the upper room. At one point he said to Peter, "Where I am going you cannot follow now, but you will follow me later." Peter could not follow Jesus as he went to the cross, but Peter would follow Jesus later. With those words, Jesus anticipated what he is now telling Peter on the beach. Following Jesus later meant he would one day be crucified like his Savior. By revealing that Peter would indeed lay down his life for Jesus, Jesus restores Peter's credibility as a leader among Jesus' followers. Jesus' words to Peter are a challenge to 21st century Western Christianity. There is a danger we will domesticate the message of the New Testament and make it say something that fits comfortably with our cultural vision of a good life, as though following Jesus is a means of attaining everything we ever wanted. In stark contrast, Jesus called Peter to a life of service that ended in violent death. Similarly, when Jesus called the great apostle Paul, he told Ananias, "I will show him how much he will suffer for my name's sake." We get an idea of what Jesus meant when we read Paul's recollection of what he had endured. The list in 2 Corinthians 11 includes floggings, imprisonment, lashings, beatings, stoning, shipwreck, sleeplessness, hunger, thirst, exposure to cold, and nakedness. When Jesus calls a person to follow him, he doesn't promise a life of ease. We aren't born again with a silver spoon in our mouths. We still have to face the troubles that are a part of the human condition in a fallen world. Sickness, poverty, redundancy, mental illness, loss of a loved one, abuse, an unfaithful spouse. We look forward to the day when these things have passed away and there's no more death or mourning or crying or pain. But that time hasn't arrived yet. When Jesus calls us to follow him, not only does he not guarantee us immunity to the realities of life in a fallen world, but he also calls us to a whole new set of challenges. The reason for this is really pretty obvious when we think about it. We are following a king whose kingdom has not yet come. We are living our lives as citizens of a kingdom that hasn't yet come. That makes us misfits, or what Peter calls aliens and strangers. And that is why Jesus said, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. It's a dangerous thing to live the Christian life believing that it is our birthright, our birthright to a good life, as our godless culture defines it. It's a recipe for disappointment and disillusionment. Better to begin, as Jesus said on one occasion, by counting the cost. As Peter's experience shows us, following Jesus can be costly. We need to be prepared. As a wise old Christian friend of mine reminds me on occasion, remember that they crucified your Lord. As a follower of Jesus, don't be discouraged when it costs. They crucified your Saviour. When you suffer for the kingdom's sake, you are following in his footsteps, as a faithful follower should. C.S. Lewis has a fascinating scene in his book, The Horse and His Boy. It consists of a conversation between the lion Aslan and a girl named Aravis. Aravis has escaped her stepmother's clutches by drugging one of her stepmother's slaves and then escaping to a neighbouring country. On the way, a lion attacks and wounds Aravis. After arriving in this other country, Aslan comes to Aravis and says this, "Draw near, Aravis, my daughter. You will not be torn this time." "This time, sir?" said Aravis. "It was I who wounded you," said Aslan. "I am the only lion you met in all your journeyings. Do you know why I tore you?" "No, sir." "The scratches on your back, tear for tear, throb for throb, blood for blood, were equal to the stripes laid on the back of your stepmother's slave because of the drugged sleep you cast upon her. You needed to know what it felt like." "Yes, sir, but please, ask on, my dear," said Aslan. "Will any more harm come to her by what I did?" "Child," said the lion, "I am telling you your story, not hers. No one has told any story but their own." Peter has to learn the same lesson from Jesus. Jesus reveals to Peter that he will one day die a martyr's death by crucifixion. On hearing this shocking news, the text says, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. And when Peter saw him, he asked, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus answered, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You must follow me." Peter wants to know if he is alone in his calling to die the violent and painful death of crucifixion. He asks Jesus for John's story, but Jesus only replies, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? You just follow me." This is the second time Jesus has said to Peter, "Follow me." Immediately after telling Peter that he would die a martyr's death, Jesus added the words, "Follow me." And now, after Peter's inquiry as to John's fate, Jesus dismisses the question and says, "You follow me." There is, however, a small but significant difference in how Jesus says, "Follow me," the second time. The first time Jesus said, "Follow me," but the second time he says, "You follow me." The second time Jesus says this, he is making an emphasis to draw a contrast. Peter, don't concern yourself with what John must do. Focus on what you must do. You, Jesus says, are to follow me. Jesus has a story for each of us. He calls on us to be faithful to that story and not to be distracted by the stories that he gives to others. We must commit wholeheartedly to what Jesus asks us to do without being distracted by what he does or doesn't ask of others. What he calls others to do is between the other person and God. Too often we look at God's calling on others and become discontented with our own lives. So one Christian student goes to university and spends 3 years struggling to make ends meet. Another comes with a car and spare money. One Christian businessman struggles to keep his business afloat. Another finds everything he touches turns to gold. One couple has a family full of healthy children. Another loses theirs to a tragic accident. One Christian family owns a beautiful home. Another struggles to pay the rent on a council house. One Christian couple lives in relative harmony. Another struggles in their relationship, and some may even have to face life alone. One missionary sees great fruit for their efforts. Another missionary ministers faithfully and sacrificially for decades and sees little for it. What do Jesus' words say to such things? Jesus reminds us not to compare his calling on our lives with his calling on the lives of others. God has called some of us to financial hardship, others of us to living in a difficult relationship, to ministering in obscurity, or to the pain of tragedy. Our response must be to live out our calling faithfully. Then the world will know how a Christian faces financial hardship, how a Christian bears up and more than bears up in a difficult relationship, how a missionary can be faithful with little to show for it and with no hope of recognition in this world, how a Christian family can rise above tragedy to find hope and consolation in the goodness of God and the promise of the resurrection. You and I must run the course God has chosen for us. The kingdom of God is about faithfulness. God assigns the tasks. There is no credit given for the task that is assigned to us, only for the faithfulness with which we carry it out. Whether your course is to raise a child or lead a country, to live with physical suffering or run the Olympic 100 meters, God looks for the same thing, faithfulness. Jesus says, "You follow me." For years, one of the great unbroken barriers of the world of sport was the 4-minute mile. Many had tried, but no one had managed to break the barrier and run the mile in less than 4 minutes. Some people began to doubt that it could be done. Others questioned whether or not it was a safe thing to do and whether it should even be attempted. Well, by the early 1950s, the pressure was on for somebody to break that barrier. The two front runners were a Brit named Bannister and an Australian named Landy. Both men were recording times within 2 seconds of this elusive achievement. Finally, on May 6, 1954, at the Iffley Road track in Oxford, Bannister ran the mile in 3 minutes, 59.4 seconds. And then 46 days later, on June 21, Landy broke Bannister's record and ran the mile in 3 minutes, 58 seconds. That set the scene for what was one of the great races of last century. In August of that same year, Landy and Bannister would meet to run the mile at the British Empire and Commonwealth Games in Vancouver, British Columbia. This would be the first time the men had competed against each other, and the race was billed as the Dream Race. Landy, who had come into the race with a faster time, took an early lead. At one point, he was 10 metres out in front of Bannister. Landy tenaciously held on to that lead while Bannister shadowed him doggedly through to the final turn. Then something happened that both men consider to be the determining moment of the race, and it's pictured here. Landy turned to look over his left shoulder for Bannister in the hope that he had finally shaken him off. At that very moment, Bannister took 2 great strides and a massive burst of speed. A moment later, Landy looked back to see Bannister surge ahead and go on to win what many considered the race of the century. Peter looked over at John. But Jesus said to Peter, "Don't concern yourself with my calling on John's life. Run in your own lane. You follow me."